This is you. You are scrolling through posts on Instagram. But where are the posts coming from? Well, the posts are stored on Instagram servers. So how are you actually reaching them? Through APIs. Let's make it easier. You might have heard this restaurant example before, but here we go. At a restaurant, the customer, you, would like to make an order request. The food is being cooked in the kitchen, but you do not go to the kitchen itself to get your food. Instead, you tell your request to the waiter, and he gets you your order when it's done being cooked in the kitchen. In this example, the waiter is the API, the customer is the client making the request to the waiter, and the kitchen is the actual server containing what you need, and the food that the waiter brings back to you is the response to your request from the server, aka from the kitchen. Let's take it back to the initial Instagram example. The Instagram mobile application on your phone plays the role of the client. The client, aka the Instagram application, needs to provide the posts on your timeline to show them to you. So, it requests the posts from an API that is going to fetch the requested posts from the Instagram servers and databases. The posts that the API returns from the server back to the client are known as the response. Let's talk a little bit more technical now. API stands for Application Programming Interface. They are important because they allow different applications to communicate with each other to share data and functionality. Let's say you are building an application that delivers products to your users. You would need to add Maps functionality in your app to get your user location or display the nearest stores to your users. Instead of writing the Maps code from scratch, you can integrate Google Maps functionalities in your app using the Google Maps API. Here, we can see how APIs allow us to use someone else's code in our own. And here, I want to highlight a few things. API and Web API. A lot of people confuse the two. API is the general concept of the interaction between two software programs following a set of rules and protocols. On the other hand, a Web API is a specific type of API that allows the communication between two software programs over the internet. It is designed to be accessed over a network, typically using the HTTP protocol, and can return data in a variety of formats such as HTML, XML, or JSON, JSON being the most used. Let's see some examples so you can understand the difference. The Google Maps API example that we talked about earlier is accessed over the internet using HTTP, meaning it is a web API. On the other hand, operating system APIs are not web APIs. They allow applications to interact with the operating system, but it is not done over the internet. An application might use the Windows API to request access to a file system or to start and stop processes. Similarly, are mobile APIs. These APIs allow applications to interact with the features of a mobile device, such as the camera, but they are not web APIs because they are not done over the internet. You might be asking yourself, how can we know what APIs are available to use, how to reach them, and how to use them? Well, API documentations. API documentation is a set of written documentation that explains the purpose and use of an API. It shows the different endpoints to access different resources on the server, the correct HTTP method to use, the input that should be passed in a request, a response example from the API, and more. API documentation is an important part of the development process as it allows developers to understand how to use an API and how to integrate it into their own applications. Some APIs are public and free to use by everyone. Others require the purchase of an API key that can be used to access the API. APIs can also be secured, and only authorized users can have access to them by using an access token or an API key. APIs can also have limits on the number of requests that can be made in a certain period of time by a user. Let's dive deeper again. In an entire architecture backend, the API layer is usually considered the top layer, which sits above the other layers. It exposes the functionality of the application to the outside world and allows other applications to access and interact with it, meaning it is responsible for handling requests from clients and delegating them to the appropriate layers below, such as the business logic layer and the data access layer, which are responsible for implementing the business rules, accessing and manipulating data, and storing and retrieving data from a database or other storages. Let's take an example. Let's say you want to fetch all countries starting with ME from a server or an app containing countries. Let's assume that we have an API documentation in our hands. You can call the API by making an HTTP request of method type GET to the following endpoint URL. It takes a query parameter, search, and you pass the input ME. The API layer will receive this request when we make it. It will make sure the input is valid, and then call the business logic layer. All of that is happening behind the scenes in the backend. It will call the business logic layer with the specified input, which might implement some extra business rules behind the scenes, which will then call the data access layer to communicate with the database and retrieve the corresponding data. In this case, it would get Mexico, and then would return the data to the API layer, so it can respond to the initial response with the data requested and the correct status code. The data will most likely be in JSON format. Let's summarize everything we learned in this video. An API, or application programming interface, is a set of rules and protocols that define how two pieces of software can communicate with each other. It allows one piece of software, called the client, to request data or services from another piece of software called the server. A web API is a specific type of API that works over the internet. API documentations are essential to provide developers with the information they need to understand how to use a specific API. Some APIs are public and free to use by everyone. Others require users to purchase an API key to access them. If this video helped you better understand what an API is, please leave a like. If you enjoyed this type of format, let me know. I usually don't make my videos in this format, but if it was helpful and you would like to see more, please let me know in the comments with any ideas in mind. Thank you and see you next time.